Hey, welcome to my podcast where I discuss the origins of all sorts of things. I'm your host, Danny Payne, and this is On the Origin of Everything. Today I'm talking about the origin of time. Well, not time itself, because even though I've read Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time, I'm not prepared or qualified to educate anyone on all that. Neither will I dive into the philosophy of time as a mental construct, though I find all of that super interesting. So today I'll aim to tackle something more tangible and more definable, like the origin of timekeeping. Let's get started. Before we had clocks or other devices for telling the time of day, we tracked time on a broader scale with calendars. The origin of calendars could be its own episode, but I'll do a quick overview. Calendars fall into three categories: lunar, solar, and lunisolar. A lunar calendar follows the phases of the moon, a solar calendar follows the position of the sun, and a lunisolar calendar combines both. An excavation in 2004 in Scotland revealed a series of 12 pits, the shapes and positions of which mimic the phases of the moon and correspond with lunar months. This ancient monument dates back to the Neolithic Era, some 10,000 years ago. The Sumerians used a lunar calendar. Improvements to that calendar by the Babylonians influenced the Jewish and Islamic calendars. The ancient Egyptians seem to have been the first to use a solar calendar. The Chinese lunisolar calendar dates back to the 14th century BCE, and the Mayans had their own intricate calendar system that combined the sun's position, a ritual calendar, and a historical dating calendar. So for at least 10,000 years, we have been looking to the sky to measure time on a seasonal and an annual scale. The ancient Egyptians divided time by the number 12, starting with 12 months as there are roughly 12 moon cycles per solar year. They also used the number 12 to divide each day, 12 parts of day and 12 parts of night, which make 24 parts to a day. Sound familiar? The ancient Babylonians contributed the division of minutes and seconds into 60 parts. I guess I had never considered why we used 12, 24, and 60 instead of, 10, 20, and 100. The ancient Romans actually had a 10-month calendar that started with March and ended with December. Had you ever noticed that October is our 10th month, even though octo stands for 8? September is for 7, October is for 8, November for 9, and December for 10. Those name assignments are from that period in Roman history where they had March as the first month and December as the 10th month. But how did that work? Was each month longer? No. Their 10 months were roughly the same length as ours, but the 61 days between the end of December and the beginning of March were unassigned. They were considered to be just a winter period. Weird, huh? This smells strongly of agrarian culture, doesn't it? Around 713 BCE, the Roman king Numa Pompilius added Januarius and Februarius, making it a 12-month calendar. And February, from the start, had only 28 days. This change from 10 months to 12 laid the groundwork for a later adjustment by Julius Caesar, who introduced a more accurate solar calendar in 45 BCE. The previous lunisolar calendar was off by about 11 days, and had to be corrected periodically by having leap months. Julius Caesar's new calendar got it down to 365.25 days per year with a leap day every 4 years, adding 1 day to February, like we still do. This was called the Julian calendar, and it was used in Europe for over 1,600 years. The calendar we use now is called the Gregorian calendar because Pope Gregory VIII introduced it in 1582 to further refine how the leap day is implemented. I know that was a lot of numbers, but just know that formal timekeeping really started with calendars. They marked a shift from merely sensing time through seasonal changes to tracking time through cosmological calculations. The first timekeeping devices involved the sun, water, and even fire. Let's go through those. The earliest timekeeping technology was simply a stick in the ground that would cast a moving shadow. The Sumerians and Babylonians used them as early as 3500 BCE, but they were just a tool to measure the passing of time in a general sense. They were precursors to the sundial. Sundials cast their shadows onto a plate that is numbered with the hours of the day. The oldest known calibrated sundial was found in Egypt, dated to about 1500 BCE. There is an obvious problem with sundials, though. They don't work during the day, and the sun also has to be out, of course. An ancient timekeeping device not dependent on a sunny day was the clepsydra, or water clock. Ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, and other civilizations used these water clocks as early as 2000 BCE. They measured the passing of time by the flow of water from one vessel to another. There would be markings on the outflow vessel to measure draining, or markings on the inflow vessel to measure the rising water. They were used for a number of purposes, like for timing ceremonies, legal proceedings, or serving as the town clock. These clepsydrae were most consistently accurate in short intervals, as they were sensitive to temperature and water pressure changes. Over time, though, improvements were made to fix those problems. I'll admit that I had never even heard of water clocks before, much less the word clepsydra. I'd also never heard of fire clocks. How do you tell time with fire? If you have a material that burns at a reliable rate, you can measure time passing. Fire clocks are a type of combustion clock, a category that includes candle clocks, incense clocks, and oil lamp clocks. The burning of an incense stick or a candlestick could represent an hour, and an hour's worth of oil in an oil lamp could be used to tell time as well. Some designs were clever, like burning a line of incense along a track with time markers, or a mechanism where the burning eventually triggered the release of a metal ball, which would fall onto a dish to chime the hour. In some cases, different incense would be burned at different times of the day, so you could even smell what time it was. Maybe not to the minute or hour, but still, what a cool idea. The earliest documented use of incense clocks was in the 10th century CE in China, and their use would spread to other parts of Asia. There was a spiritual and ritualistic component to fire clocks too. In some East Asian philosophies, the slow, fragrant burning of incense, while signaling the passage of time, was also seen as a meditative aid, symbolizing impermanence and encouraging mindfulness. So we've covered calendars, sundials, water clocks, and fire clocks, and the next innovation in timekeeping involved gravity. The first mechanical clocks were gravity clocks, as I'm choosing to call them. You'll see why. First appearing in northern Italy and southern Germany in the 13th century, the earliest mechanical clocks were massive structures placed inside a tower. They used suspended weights as their source of energy to turn gears. They didn't have a clock face yet. That wouldn't come for another 100 years or so. They would tell time not by displaying dials, but by chiming a bell on the hour. They were most commonly found in monasteries and cathedral towns to regulate prayer times and daily routines, but later expanded to public use in town squares. How accurate were these first mechanical clocks? They weren't bad. They were an improvement on the previous timekeeping technology, but they were still off by 15 minutes or so per day. Over the next 200 years, though, their accuracy improved with the implementation of the pendulum. Look, I'm not a mechanically minded or a mechanically savvy person. I've read about how pendulums improved timekeeping accuracy, and I still don't get it. But that's okay. The important takeaway is that they were a huge advancement, reducing error from minutes to seconds per day. So, the first mechanical clocks were tower clocks, then clock towers with clock faces and pendulums, and eventually we domesticated them in the mid-1600s by creating a miniature version we all fondly know as the grandfather clock. If you'd never thought about it before, the purpose of their tall and long design is to house the swinging pendulum and the hanging weights. Before grandfather clocks, or long case clocks, there were other types of clocks for home use, like wall clocks and table clocks. But even though they were smaller and more portable, They weren't as accurate, and they required more frequent winding and resetting. The grandfather clock became a preferred option for their accuracy, long spans of timekeeping capability, and aesthetics. They are an entire piece of furniture that could become a family heirloom. But the one major weakness of pendulum clocks is that they're pretty much worthless on a ship. To tell time properly, they relied on a stable surface, so sailors had to use something else. Now, maritime navigation is a whole thing, involving the stars, the sun, a chronometer, and hourglasses to calculate a ship's position on the globe while out at sea. Chronometers were timepieces designed specifically for the needs of maritime navigation, while hourglasses helped by providing the passing of time in intervals used to determine the speed of the ship. Explorers like Columbus and Magellan heavily relied on hourglasses during their excursions. Once again, we used gravity to calculate the passing of time, this time with sand. And it turns out that hourglasses weren't always filled with sand. Some of them were filled with finely ground materials like eggshells or marble. Even the sand ones couldn't just be filled with sand from a beach. The sand would need to be treated or processed to yield granules of roughly the same size. Otherwise, the sand wouldn't pass through the narrow neck with even flow. These sand clocks were definitely around during the 14th century, but possibly earlier. I kinda want one now. I'd love to get one that was used on the high seas, so I can use it at home to bake a pizza. I've talked a lot about clocks, but what about watches? Before wristwatches, there were pocket watches. And the first pocket watches didn't even fit into a pocket, they were so big. But that's because they were first designed to be worn around the neck on a chain. In the early 1500s, a German clockmaker named Peter Henlein started making pomander watches. A pomander, first of all, is a metal ball filled with fragrances that was worn around the neck to mask odor or ward off pestilences. They remind me of censers, used ritualistically and symbolically in some religious ceremonies, but the histories of pomanders and censers are not connected. So Peter Henlein combined a clock with a pomander and made a pomander watch. He wasn't the first to make personal watches, and he might not have even made the first pomander watch, but the oldest one we have that still works was his creation from 1505. These devices came to be known as Nuremberg eggs, as they were primarily produced in Nuremberg, Germany, where Peter Henlein was making them. It's worth mentioning that the average person wasn't walking around with a pomander, much less a pomander watch or a Nuremberg egg. These early timepieces were for the very wealthy, for nobility, not peasants. They were a status symbol more than anything. Innovative, groundbreaking technology is often too expensive for the masses at first, but over time they become more affordable. I mean, the first cellular phone was the equivalent of $12,000 in today's money, and now everyone has one in their pocket. The same thing happened with pocket watches. They started out as a luxury only the rich could afford, but over the next few centuries, with industrial advancements and mass production techniques, by the mid-1800s, pocket watches were accessible by most people. Wristwatches came about in the 1800s, but they were primarily a women's fashionable jewelry item for the elite. Few men wore wristwatches as they were considered a feminine accessory. Wristwatches were for girls and pocket watches were for boys, and nothing short of a war could have changed that. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, military officers began attaching their pocket watches to leather straps to wear them around their wrists for convenience in active warfare. These pocket watch wristwatches were also used in World War I, and they came to be known as trench watches. They were first used by high-ranking officers only, but by the end of the war, all ranks were issued these trench watches, and it changed the collective attitude toward wristwatches. Once associated with femininity, they became a sign of military competence, almost like a badge of honor. The watchmakers capitalized on this shift, and by the 1930s, the wristwatch had basically replaced the pocket watch in daily use. I I love how the personal timepiece has always been a marker of social class. Think about it. The Pomander watch and the Nuremberg egg were handcrafted works of art, made of expensive materials, even silver and gold at times. Although these portable timepieces became more accessible to the average person in the form of pocket watches, there were tiers of quality and craftsmanship that set men apart into social ranks. A baker's nickel pocket watch wasn't the same status symbol as a banker's gold-cased pocket watch. The same thing happened with wristwatches after World War I. Everyone could wear a watch, but only the real ballers could afford a Rolex. And this still goes on today. Expensive watches are a symbol of wealth, power, and prestige. I used to work with a trust fund kid who agonized over which Rolex he should get. He eventually went with a $20,000 one, and it was really hard for me to pretend like I understood his purchase on any level whatsoever. Alright, let's take a break right here, and when I come back, I'll get into the standardization of time schedules, including the introduction of time zones, universal time, and daylight saving time. So don't go anywhere. This episode is brought to you by nothing. To help keep ads off this show, consider donating by clicking the Patreon link in the show notes or by going to patreon.com/ontheoriginofeverything. Another way you can support this show is by giving it a 5-star rating and review, or by following it, or sharing it. Let's build a community of people that are curious and always learning. Now, back to the show. Part 2 picks up the origin of timekeeping with the need to standardize time. We had come so far in dialing in the annual calendar, then creating reliable daily timekeeping devices, but a problem arose as industries began to connect over longer and longer distances. Each town kept time based on the sun as it rose and set in that location, which meant that noon in New York was different from noon in Boston or Philly. It was difficult to coordinate business transactions without everyone being on the same page about what time it was, especially as the railroads were expanding across Europe and America. We really needed to synchronize time. The standardization of time began with the practical needs of 18th century English mariners who needed to determine longitude out at sea. Remember how they used chronometers? Those chronometers were set to the local time at Greenwich, England. It was known as the mean solar time at Greenwich, and acted as the consistent reference point for calculating longitude with their chronometers. By the mid-1800s, the mean solar time at Greenwich was adopted as the standard time across Britain, especially for railway scheduling. It became the legal time in Great Britain in 1880, and the 1884 International Meridian Conference, held in Washington, D.C., formally designated the mean solar time at Greenwich as the prime meridian, which is 0 degrees longitude, and came to be known as Greenwich Mean Time, or GMT. This was the moment in which the 24 worldwide time zones were born. The 4 time zones in North America had already existed for a year, put in place by the railroad companies, standardizing their schedules to prevent accidents and eliminate logistic confusion. Even though the 1884 International Meridian Conference established the framework of time zones, it would take several decades for the whole world to adopt it. Similarly, the 4 time zones in North America, though used by certain industries, wouldn't be adopted by the entire population until 1918, when the Standard Time Act was passed. This act officially established the 4 time zones into U.S. law, and it also introduced daylight saving time. My whole life I've been told that daylight saving time was started to help farmers make the most of the daylight hours year-round. But it turns out that it actually came out of the war effort during World War I. But how does changing the clocks by an hour help fight a war anyway? Well, it was a measure to conserve energy, particularly coal and oil. By shifting an hour of daylight from morning to evening, it reduced the use of artificial lighting and heating, improving efficiency in war-related industries. This seemed to me like an original idea, until I learned that German and Austrian-Hungarian empires did it first in 1916, Then the English, the French, and many other European powers did it too. The US finally followed suit in 1918. But guess what? It was repealed just a year later. As soon as the war ended, we were like, screw this daylight saving thing. But only to have it reinstated during World War II. And it never really went away after that. Scientific refinements to Greenwich Mean Time led to universal time and eventually coordinated universal time, which blended atomic precision with the Earth's wobbly rotation. And hey, speaking of atoms, what about the atomic clock? The first atomic clock was achieved by a team led by Harold Lyons at the U.S. National Bureau of Standards in 1948. But what is an atomic clock and how does it work? Well, they're pretty complicated. I mean, it's quantum physics. But basically, an atomic clock uses the insanely consistent oscillation frequencies of cesium atoms as its divisions of time, which regulates an electronic oscillator, resulting in extraordinarily precise timekeeping. Like, it sort of makes sense, but it sort of doesn't either. Okay, if a clock at its core has two basic components, and one of those components is a mechanism that oscillates at a steady rate. The atom's natural extremely rapid oscillation frequency acts like the pendulum. The other component is just a way to measure the oscillations. Atomic clocks achieve just that. The ticks of the clocks we had been living by would drift due to imperfections in the calibrations and the inherent limitations in human-made precision. Atomic frequencies offer us unimaginable accuracy, with the potential of losing less than 1 second over a span of 30 billion years. That's how dialed in they are. In comparison, a pendulum clock has an error rate of about 15 seconds per day. It oscillates at 1 tick per second, while a cesium atomic clock has 9,192,631,770 oscillations per second. A quartz clock, which I sort of skipped over, has 32,768 oscillations per second. Those came about in the late 60s and greatly improved accuracy, but they don't hold a candle to the incredible atomic clock. You might be thinking, as I started thinking, why would we ever need such precise timekeeping capability? A discrepancy of 15 seconds in a day's time isn't going to make or break me. A quartz clock has a discrepancy of about 15 seconds per month. Am I really going to be affected by that? Do we really need a clock that is 9 billion times more precise than that? Well, actually, yes, we do. Not for going to bed on time, or making sure we celebrate our birthdays on the right day, but for navigation, telecommunication, and anything that requires satellite transmissions, including GPS. A tiny microsecond of error in these systems will yield gigantic discrepancies. You can use sports as an analogy. Think about how a slight error in the swing of a club results in a golf ball landing way off course. Imagine how much more important it is to eliminate timing errors when dealing with satellite transmissions to and from Earth. So the atomic clock isn't just a flex for how good we could get at calculating time. It enabled global time standardization. Now, we may have mechanical watches, quartz watches, and even smartwatches on our wrists, and analog or digital clocks on our walls, but we don't have personal atomic clocks. Instead, we have clocks and watches that synchronize to one of the many atomic clocks on the planet. The closest one to me is in Boulder, Colorado, at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the same place where the first atomic clock was achieved by Harold Lyons and his team back when it was called the U.S. National Bureau of Standards. Learning that the closest atomic clock was in Boulder, Colorado, jogged my memory about something that happened in high school. It was 2002, and I remember my buddy George had just visited some family in Boulder and had come back with a watch that he would not shut up about. Like, check out this new G-Shock watch I just got from my dad. He said it was solar powered and that it was an atomic watch. I didn't know what that meant, and he was glad to explain it to me. It was all lost on me, man. The watch I was wearing, I probably found in a dumpster. I could not care less about that stupid watch that he just went on and on about. I couldn't believe how many miles he got out of that story, which was basically just that the watch was synced to some super accurate clock in Denver. Whatever, bro. But now that I know the significance of the atomic clock, I must publicly apologize to him for merely humoring him back then. That was a pretty cool watch, George. I actually looked it up, and 2002 was the year that Casio released their first G-Shock watch with atomic synchronization. You were right to be excited, dude. And it's fitting that you grew up to be a pilot, and that I grew up to record podcasts out of my basement. Alright, that concludes our episode on the origins of timekeeping. But I'll leave you with one last fun fact. Have you ever wondered why they do a ball drop on New Year's Eve in Times Square? Times Square? I'm kidding. It's called Times Square because of the New York Times building, and it has nothing to do with what I'm about to tell you. So, this practice of dropping a big ball from the top to the bottom of a pole dates back to Greenwich, England. As early as 1833, they dropped a ball to signal to captains of ships passing on the River Thames that it was 1 p.m., so they could set their chronometers to the mean solar time at Greenwich. They were called time balls. Cool, huh? So every New Year's Eve when we gather around to watch the ball drop, we're reenacting a 200-year-old timekeeping ritual that is now a symbolic tradition. And with that, I'll sign off. Until next time, so long. Research, music, and production was all done by Jezere Wilson. This podcast is listener-supported, owned and operated by Jez and myself under the On the Origin of Everything, LLC, in the United States. All rights reserved. We can be reached via email at info@ontheoriginpod.com.